The world has suddenly changed. 6 months ago, if I was talking to you, old technology versus new technology, which old technology still works, which you can still rely on, and what you can still use. And then what new technology you should be embracing, what you can safely avoid, and what you should try to embrace. But now it's no longer about the new technology that you can or can't use. It's actually about new technology you can't avoid. Many of you had never heard of Zoom before, and now you're finding yourself attending talks via Zoom. Many of you have perhaps seen a YouTube video without actually realizing that YouTube was a more expansive tool on which one could actually do live presentations. For some of you, this might even be your first YouTube presentation. It's no longer about the tech you should or shouldn't use. It's about the tech that you can avoid and can't avoid. But first, before I talk about the technology side of things, I want to talk about how our lives are about to change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, because how our lives change will also dictate what technology we use and also how technology will change. And already we've seen some major shifts in the way we live and work, whether you talk about lockdown or post-lockdown. In a world of social distancing and of any surface or person potentially being a source of COVID-19 infection, that has changed the way we work. So an organization called Nielsen, which is a global media monitoring and trends tracking organization, has come up with a model where they're showing the primary shifts in each phase of the pandemic. And in the initial phases of the pandemic, the biggest demands on people have been to limit touch points. In other words, not to touch anything they don't have to outside of their home. It also demands precautions wherever they go. So wearing masks when you go out, for example. And then this one, which is not as obvious, is to authenticate information. This is a key demand that's been made on people because we are exposed to so much misinformation, what I call nonsense, but some people just call bad information or social media rumors and myths. And people are having to decide whether they want to remain in confined places or whether they want to be in open spaces. And that particular dynamic is going to shape a lot of the response to the pandemic in the coming months and probably the coming year or two. The main technology shift that we're seeing is that people are starting to value virtual experiences before physical experiences. Not that they think it's better. In most cases, people are feeling that the virtual is a poor replica of the real world and they hanker for that physical world. But in terms of keeping themselves safe and being protected, they're valuing the virtual above the physical. And that is the reason why all of you suddenly find of online presentations and the likes. But along with valuing the virtual, they also value their personal space. So when they do venture into the physical world, and particularly next week when we enter lockdown phase 3 and we're allowed to exercise outdoors and the like, personal space is going to become critical. Then once we move into this next phase and people start getting used to the new world of COVID-19 precautions, restrictions, and limitations, it goes beyond just the personal. It also goes into how you interact with the world in general. And what we're already starting to see is that there's a far greater reliance on local services. People don't want to travel far to provide services, and people don't want to travel far to receive services. So, for example, you're going to rely on a local grocery store before you're going to go to a major supermarket that's a lot further away. When you're looking for services like plumbers or electricians, you're going to look for someone who's close by, possibly even in your neighborhood. And then along with that, we're going to find a much stronger reliance on essentials. So as much as lockdown has been about essential services being allowed to carry on operating, we ourselves in our consumer behavior are going to focus on essentials rather than luxury goods or discretionary spending on things that we don't actually need. So we'll focus on what do we need rather than what we would like or what we would want in a perfect world. And that will go hand in hand with tremendous financial constraints. We've seen in the United States, for example, record unemployment, and we're going to have that in South Africa as well. We already have incredibly high unemployment, which is well over 30%. But with this pandemic, we're expecting to see unemployment rise to around the 50% mark. And that is going to have a knock-on effect for everybody. Even retired people who are not working, who depend on their savings for their income as a result of interest-bearing products or instruments, they're going to find they're earning less from those instruments because the interest rates have plummeted. Just in the last few months, they've come down by more than 2%, and they're expecting it to go down another 1%. So what anyone is earning from their savings is going to plummet. So even for retired people, there's going to be tremendous financial constraints in the coming year or two. There is a plus to that. The upside is that we're expecting far greater social solidarity. Now, we saw that with the beginning of lockdown. Everyone in South Africa was supportive of the president to an extent that we've never seen before in this country. But people are also becoming more and more supportive of each other. So, for example, one of the biggest growth areas in online payments in the last 3 months has been in donations. So there's an organization called PayFast, which processes payments mostly online. Firstly, just to give some context, they've seen something like 4,000 new organizations sign on to their platform to be able to accept payments online or electronically. And with that, they looked to see where the biggest increase was happening in spending. And one of the biggest increase areas, I think it was the fifth biggest area of spending increase, was in charitable donations. And it went up something like 150%, which is massive. And that's an indication of the extent to which people care and the extent to which social solidarity is a major feature of lockdown and of the pandemic. If the pandemic continues for an extended period, we won't necessarily remain in lockdown, but we will certainly remain in a period of social distancing, and we'll also find that financial constraints become worse for many people, from financial constraint to financial desperation. And many people will be surviving on the absolute basics. But one of the things that will result from that is huge dependence on local services. Whereas previously, what I mentioned was about preferring local services to ones that require travel. Now it will be a dependence on local services. So what that requires is that people start doing their homework on what is available to them locally, what is almost a shout away as opposed to a trip away, because that is going to dictate what services become available to you. The big negative, aside from financial desperation that Nielsen anticipates in this period, is a social backlash. To some extent, we see that already with people starting to resist any attempt by government to control their movements, protests against what is required of them. And that could also result in further social backlash, people becoming quite aggressive about being told what. So that's a global trend. What's the situation in South Africa? Well, a company called Geopol did a study across the entire African continent, and primarily in South Africa. That's one of their main areas of research, but it included other African countries, and they found a very similar trend across all countries of what people expect to do in the month after lockdown ends. In other words, in June 2020. And it was quite interesting to see the top 4 options that respondents chose. 49%, half of all respondents, are going to visit friends or family locally the moment lockdown ends. Of course, in lockdown phase 3, we're not supposed to visit friends and family. That will become possible in phase 2 and primarily in phase 1. But once it becomes possible, half of all people, their first choice is visiting friends and family. That talks to social cohesion, and that talks to the essential need for social contact and bonding. So as much as some of us are enjoying experiencing the world virtually, at least half of us are desperate to get back to physical contact with other human beings. The next biggest one, not a big surprise, regardless of your age group. 37%, more than a third, said the first thing they're going to do is to get a haircut, to go for grooming or for other beauty services. So the hairdressers and the beauticians are going to have a massive boom when lockdown ends completely. Unfortunately, it won't make up for the months in which they were locked down and couldn't work and couldn't earn. But there's light at the end of the tunnel for them. They're going to be busier than they've ever been before. And then for the other category of business that has really suffered in this time, restaurants, they are also going to see a massive boom. 28% of people say the first thing they're going to do is go to a restaurant. They want to dine out. And then travel and tourism, which has also suffered tremendously once lockdown ends completely. So this will only be once we get to phase 1. 19% say first thing they want to do is go on a trip, visit family, go on vacation, etc. Now, that last one in particular is one where technology is going to play a massive role. You're going to have to learn how to use the online travel tools, ticketing tools, airline sites and apps and the like. If you are planning to travel, you need to really do your homework. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that homework effectively is by scouring these online sites. The airline sites and the hotel sites in particular are giving a tremendous amount of information on how they are dealing with each phase of lockdown and social distancing. Those industries have changed forever. And certainly for the next few years, you're going to have to do your homework before you travel, before you use an airline, before you use a hotel. And the first port of call in terms of that homework is the websites of these organizations. How will shopping change? This is also a question that GeoPoll put to consumers across the African continent. And it does change according to age group, but generally speaking, this still holds true. So, for example, what will people buy more of? Well, 20% say they're going to increase their shopping for food in particular, but 60% say they're shopping less. Are they, that's in terms of going shopping. Are they spending more? Well, while 20% might be shopping more, only 16% are buying more. So that gives an indication of the trouble that retail is in right now, and also how constrained people are in their shopping behavior. 69% say they are purchasing less than before. And that spells a bit of an apocalypse for retailers. So you can expect to see that when you go into malls in the coming months, you're going to see a lot of shops that are closed, stores that you used to go to regularly that no longer exist. That's a sad, very sad reality of the impact of the pandemic on our economy. Discretionary spending will almost vanish for the next year or so. And those stores that depend on discretionary spending are unfortunately going to go out of business. Where they remain in business, they'll be incredibly constrained and in deep financial difficulty. So where you can, support local small stores as much as possible. One of the things we're seeing, for example, in the world of takeaway foods is that many restaurants that previously were fine dining restaurants or sit-down restaurants have become takeaway or delivery services. But they are doing so under tremendous financial constraints. Many of them are doing it just to be able to keep their staff employed. And what some of them have done is partnered with ride-sharing services like Uber Eats and Bolt. There's one problem with those services, though. It is that they take a big cut of the payment that you are making to that restaurant. They also increase the cost of ordering from that restaurant. So where possible, order directly from a restaurant. So the phone, in that case, is actually better technology than the app. Going through an app, and it's the ones I mentioned, other apps as well, to order takeaway food, it's going to cost you more, and it's also going to benefit the restaurant less. So rather than going through the app, use the good old telephone. You can use WhatsApp as well with some restaurants, but phoning a restaurant and checking whether they are delivering themselves is a far better way of supporting small businesses and struggling businesses than using an app. So that's one of the examples that I like to use of where technology and new tech and the kind of smartphone apps that are available are not always a better solution. They don't solve the problems that a good old phone call or personal contact can actually solve. Then there was another area that I looked at, which was media consumption, how media consumption is changing. Are people trying to avoid the news, or are they watching more news? And this was interesting. Only 15% of respondents are consuming less media. A massive 66%, 2/3 of people across South Africa and across the continent are consuming more because they're desperate to know what's happening and what's going to happen next. And when you look at what the sources of their information might be, you'd think that websites must be thriving because of the desperate need for information. But in fact, the number one source of information remains TV. 45% of respondents say that they're using TV as a primary source. So a lot of people are using multiple sources, and the respondents could choose any of the sources that are available. So 45% said television, and next highest, 40% said social media, which is Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter and the like. But that is also where misinformation comes in, because television mostly is relatively objective, not always, as we know, but mostly objective. Social media is massively subjective, and most of the information in social media has to be scrutinized, and you have to double check it elsewhere. And then just behind social media, 39% of respondents said radio. So TV at 45%, social media at 40%, radio at 39%. And the segment that's suffering severely is newspapers. Only 15% are relying on newspapers. And we're actually seeing magazines going out of business right now. All the Caxton publications, all the associated news publications, that's Fair Lady, Cosmopolitan, and the like, are all closing down. It's tragic what's happening in media. But newspapers are managing to survive because they're large organizations with deep pockets, or at least a long line of credit with the banks. But some of those are also going to close down. Only 15% are reading newspapers. But what's really interesting, what's neck and neck with newspapers as a source of information is friends and family, 14%, which is pretty much the same as newspapers. So as many people rely on their friends and family for news as they do on newspapers. And that really spells at this stage a massive fall for newspapers in terms of being a source of information. Then shopping is also changing dramatically. Many of you will have used online shopping for the first time. Some will have used the phone for it. Some stores do allow you to phone in an order, and some allow you to send an order via WhatsApp. But to get an understanding of the impact that this crisis is having on e-commerce and online shopping, we only need to look at American e-commerce penetration. We tend to lag behind the American market in terms of technology uptake by anything from 18 months to 5 years. But in e-commerce, it's more than 10 years that we lag behind in terms of the percentage of people who shop online. So, for example, in 2009, around 6% of Americans shopped online. In South Africa, we got to 6% only last year. So literally 10 years behind America in terms of online shopping. But the big shift is what's happening now. So in 2019, for example, 16% of Americans shopped online. They expected to reach around the 24-25% level by around the year 2024-25. What's happened in just the last 2 months, they've gone up from 16% to 27% of American shopping online. So think of that. From 2009 to 2019, it went from 6% to 16%, went up 10% in 10 years. You could say 11% if you rounded out the numbers. And then from 2019 to April 2020, it went up 11% in just 8 weeks. So the growth that took 10 years previously now took just 8 weeks. And we saw something very similar in South Africa. Here we had something like 6% of people shopping online regularly last year. During the pandemic, during lockdown rather, it's been as high as 37%, according to some measures, of people shopping online regularly. So once lockdown is completely over, once all the stores open, and that is next week, we can expect to see a lot of those 37% going back to regular physical shopping. But a big proportion will have firstly discovered online shopping for the first time, will discover that it works mostly. It doesn't always work. We have tremendous frustration with some of the places where we shop online. But those people who find that it does work are going to continue using it. Maybe not regularly, but they will carry on using it. And therefore, the percentage of people shopping online regularly is going to shoot up. And then there are also those people who find that their fear of shopping online is not as great as the fear of going into stores. Once you start going back to stores and you see everyone wearing their masks and you having your hands sprayed at every entrance, and you have to be worried about anything you pick up, and you get home and you have to sanitize everything, that combined fear is going to be greater than the fear that many people have of shopping online for the first time. So we're going to see, even in South Africa, that same trend of people shopping regularly online shooting up, probably equivalent to the American growth, around the 10% mark, maybe even more, because we came off such an incredibly low base in this country. So it'll create a retail channel shift unlike anything we've ever seen, from an organization called eMarketer that has been measuring these stats. They saw a similar level of growth, but they had expected the growth that we're seeing today only in the next, or the growth that we've seen in the last 2 months, they were expecting only in the next 5 years. So that raises the question, what else is going to change if we're seeing these radical shifts in areas like retail and the like? Are we going to see similar shifts in other areas? We already have. So take entertainment. I'd be curious to know how many of you have discovered Netflix and Showmax that you weren't using before. And if you want to put up your hand, you can just say yes in the chat room. Brian will count up the yeses, and he'll give me a number in the next few minutes, and I'll come back to that number. So just in the chat window, just say yes, and I'll get a sense of how many of you have watched Netflix for the first time during the pandemic, Netflix or Showmax or any other online streaming service. And that'll give us an indication of the shift in this particular grouping. But it's not just amongst retired people that we've seen a big shift in entertainment habits. Globally, we've seen Netflix usage shoot up dramatically, and Netflix's share price is one of the strongest performing share prices of any share in the world because of the huge growth that it has seen. The irony here is that Netflix is no longer able to produce movies or TV series during lockdown and during the period of social distancing. So in the long run, you might see them suffer, in fact, because people will find that there's nothing new. But they will find ways to bring content online. There is already a backlog of content that they have available that they are going to launch online. So we are seeing new series and new movies coming online over the next month or two. It's more in 6 and 12 months' time that we're going to see whether they are able to weather the storm and if they can carry on making movies and series. In South Africa, Showmax has seen a massive boost, and DStv, which was dropping dramatically because of the challenge of Netflix and Showmax, is also seeing a bit of a boost because their apps that are available on smartphones as well as on tablets allow people to watch a wider variety of shows than they could before. They've added, for example, to their cheapest bouquets, they've added new services and the likes. So has Showmax. Showmax, for the first time, is allowing live news to be watched through its platform. And that is an indication of the big change that we're going to see in streaming services. Streaming services as opposed to scheduled television. And the big difference between scheduled television and streaming services until now was that scheduled television had live news broadcasts and they had live sports. And that was what was saving MultiChoice and DStv from being completely gobbled up by the likes of Netflix, because Netflix didn't offer any live services. They still don't. But we can see with Showmax, the pivot that they are making. Showmax is South Africa's answer to Netflix. It started up in South Africa a year or two before Netflix arrived here, so that gave them time to build an audience. But very cleverly, they've now done something that Netflix doesn't seem able to do yet, and that is to add live news channels. That's just the first step towards eventually being able to offer live sports as well. And once you have live sports and news on a streaming channel, you have a very compelling offering. So this is one of the reasons why we think that DStv and Showmax are going to collaborate very closely in the coming years to merge their channels. You may know Showmax is also owned by MultiChoice, which owns DStv. And it was MultiChoice's attempt to create a streaming competitor to Netflix before Netflix arrived in this market. They've done so very successfully. And they have a fantastic catalogue of South African content in particular. So there's a vast reservoir of localized content that people can enjoy there. And that is also one of their great strengths. So South Africa will see a slightly different shift in entertainment to the rest of the world, where it's a competition between Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime Video, which you can also get in South Africa, but it has limited content here. And then a few other channels as well, a few other streaming services that are available in other countries, but not in South Africa. Here, it's a war between Showmax specifically and Netflix. You'll hear about Apple TV as well, Apple TV Plus, which is also available here. And as I said, Amazon Prime Video also available here. But one doesn't actually hear much about them. They're not involved in local content, whereas Netflix has invested heavily in local content and will continue to do so. And that's why it's a Netflix versus Showmax war in South Africa. That's going to be good for consumers because it means that they will keep trying to attract you from one to the other. And that means that they will keep trying to bring content that is relevant to the local market. So we already have seen a boom in filmmaking and TV production in South Africa, thanks to the efforts of Showmax and Netflix, and that boom will carry on. So that's the bright spot in this pandemic. It's the one sector that will thrive and that we can all benefit from. The cost of the services are incredibly cheap compared to going to a movie. So if you're paying, for example, 150 Rand a month for Netflix, or something similar for Showmax, that already is the price of 2 movie tickets. So if you go to a movie with a partner once a month, it's actually it costs as much as subscribing to an online streaming service for a month. And that is a pointer to the next segment that's going to suffer, that already is in deep trouble, and that is the cinema sector. So, of course, cinemas have been closed for the last few months, and they'll remain closed for the foreseeable future until we get to lockdown phase 1. But even then, social distancing means that any cinema that previously, for example, had 100 seats in the cinema, now literally has only 50 seats, because people will not be allowed to sit next to each other due to social distancing rules during the pandemic. That will also be the kind of equation that you're going to see on airlines. Airlines will probably be mandated to have an open seat between every passenger. That means they will be flying half loads, but that also means that the price of tickets is probably going to go up by 50% or more. So air travel is in as much trouble as the cinema segment. But we're talking about entertainment right now. The cinema as we know it may well have come to an end for the next few years. Once the pandemic is over, we'll see massive reopening of cinemas. But for now, it's a sector that is dead on its feet, regrettably. The next area of entertainment that will not be able to benefit as much as streaming entertainment, the likes of Netflix and Showmax, because they simply do not provide that experience in the virtual world that they did in the physical world, of course, is sports. Sports is in deep trouble. Even if sports goes back to live events that are played without spectators but are broadcast on TV, you're going to see massive losses being suffered. So one of the first areas where we've actually seen these losses being measured is in the United States in the National Football League, where they've discovered or they've looked at the cost of staging live events versus having virtual events without an audience. So they call these ghost games. A ghost game is a game where you play the regular live sports match between two teams, but you don't have any spectators. In other words, you have ghosts watching you. It's being broadcast, so the broadcast rights are still available. But look at these numbers in terms of how much sports franchises are going to lose. The New York Yankees, the biggest American football team and one of the richest sports franchises in the world, competing with the likes of Manchester United and Barcelona and Real Madrid for the highest revenue of any sports team in the world. They will make a loss of $312 million during a 32-game season without spectators. The rest of them, their losses are a lot smaller, but also massive. So the top 10 American football teams will all lose well over $100 million in a typical season without spectators. But that is also something that they have to pay their players their full salaries. And we're expecting to see player salaries plummet as well. Already in soccer, we're seeing massive negotiation between teams and their players about taking lower salaries. So everything changes in that world. For the spectator, it's different as well. The spectator can only view on TV, and there's not the same excitement when there isn't a crowd roaring and responding to what's happening in the stadium. So we're going to see interest in sport plummeting. Initially, when live sport starts again without spectators, there is going to be massive interest. And that's already happening in Germany with the Bundesliga resuming live sport, but without spectators. So initially, because of the hunger and the almost desperation for live sports, people will watch, but gradually the interest will fade because it'll feel not very different from watching a movie or TV series. So live sport will compete with the likes of Netflix and Showmax in the coming year or so. The next segment where we're going to see massive shifts driven by technology is education. And you may well be aware, if you have children or grandchildren who are at school or who are parents of school kids, you'll be well aware of the fact that for the last few months, the conversations have been more about technology than about curriculum. So private schools, and as well as government schools that have more well-off families attending those schools, moved very quickly towards online teaching and learning. And we saw Google Classroom in particular, which doesn't look very different to what you're experiencing here. It's the same people who make YouTube, but they've developed this a very elaborate meetings app which allows for different forms of teaching online. Google Classroom is one of the primary tools being used globally for online teaching. And we are seeing that the likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams are also being used extensively for teaching. Zoom, not so popular because of security issues and experiences of something called Zoom bombing, which is unwanted people intruding in a meeting. But generally speaking, the typical school kid who has the means has now experienced online teaching. And just to put that in context, the proportion of people who are watching this talk who said that they have been watching Netflix for the first time is something like 86% of people watching this particular presentation. So 86% of you have gone onto Netflix for the first time. Now that is probably exactly the same experience of school kids learning online for the first time. Probably even more, probably more than 86% are attending school online for the first time in their lives. So two things are going to flow out of this. Firstly, when schools resume at the beginning of June, next week, in other words, many schools have decided that only a small portion of students will be allowed to come back to school, or they have to take turns coming to school. My kids' school, for example, is allowing half the kids to come on a Monday, the other half on a Tuesday. Then the first half come again on the Wednesday, and the second half on the Thursday. And then the Friday is for testing and the like. So in between, when they don't come to school, even those who are physically going to school will also be taking half of their lessons online. So that doesn't end. That is going to be the norm, at least for most of the rest of this year. So what that then means is that beyond the pandemic, all schools will have discovered that online teaching is feasible, and there are some subjects for which it works better and some for which it doesn't. And particularly schools that are constrained for physical resources, classroom sizes, and the like, are going to find that they can increase enrollment by allowing online teaching, online classes, because there will be families who prefer for their kids to study from home. The whole homeschooling movement, which is quite powerful in South Africa, which is legitimate. You have to have the right permissions from the Department of Education. That entire movement has come into its own during this crisis. But traditional schools are also learning that homeschooling is now part of their mix, and some will allow an element of homeschooling. So teachers are going to find themselves having to balance teaching in front of a physical class and teaching in front of a virtual class. The upside of that, the real positive spin-off, is that they can reach far more students. And that might make schooling, certainly from high-quality teachers, more inclusive. The downside of that, of course, is that a high proportion of the population doesn't have access to the tools to be able to enjoy online teaching and learning. And this is where the government has to step in a very big way. Already, they've mandated that a wide range of websites and apps and services be zero rated by the mobile operators. And that means that if you go to a particular website or you use a particular app, that there'll be no data charges. So you would think that would be the solution to this problem, but it's not, for quite a few reasons. One of them is that each mobile operator designates its own set of zero-rated sites and services. So it may be all very well that Vodacom might say that access to Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, is free to everyone. But MTN might decide that another online encyclopedia is going to be free to their users. So a school can't say that you have to use this particular resource, let's say Wikipedia or Investopedia or whatever the case might be, for a specific subject or as a resource or input for essays, because half the students won't have free access to that specific resource. So what we've called on as Worldwide Works, my organization, we actually called on government to have a standard set of resources that all operators have to make free. So operators shouldn't be able to decide only for themselves. Yes, they can decide they want to make certain sites and services free, but they also need to comply with a government mandated set of resources that are free for everyone to use. That's just the first step. The second step is to make sure that all kids have the tools that they need to be able to access the teaching material. And that also includes having access to a decent signal. And many underprivileged areas and what they call underserved areas don't have a decent signal. So even if you had free data, even if you had a smartphone or a tablet on which you could receive lessons, you might not have the signal that allows you to receive that lesson. Many teachers also are in a situation where they themselves are immune compromised. They're either over 60 or they have health issues, which means that they shouldn't be exposed to a classroom full of kids. And many of those teachers have to continue teaching online. And for those teachers, these are also similar issues. So we have a teacher, for example, at our school who can't afford the amount of data that she needs to be able to deliver the lessons effectively. Now, it's really up to the school to make sure that she does have enough data. The school should be providing that. But these are issues that still haven't been resolved. So we have a very complex educational environment that's already evolved and that will keep evolving. The answers are not all there. There are many solutions, but the solutions are not necessarily the answers. So we're entering a world of tremendous opportunity in education and tremendous resources in education, but also tremendous complexity. And we hope that if we talk about this subject a year from now, that many of these issues will have resolved themselves. And then the final issue that I wanted to talk about, and here I encourage you to put questions in the chat room, and Brian will field them to me if they're ones that you want me to answer after I've finished talking. But the last area that I want to talk about, how the future is going to be reshaped and has already been reshaped, is the area of health. And that obviously is a concern for every one of you. How does the administration of health change? How does your experience of health, both with regard to doctors and hospitals, change? And many other elements also of the health ecosystem, pharmacies, for example. Well, we've already seen all of that has changed. Right now, the experience of going to a doctor is not a scary experience because most doctors are finding their rooms almost empty. Their schedules are almost empty because people are only going to the doctor if they desperately need to. Regular checkups are not happening at the moment if they're not essential. So my doctor's rooms, for example, has a waiting room where 2 out of every 3 chairs has been turned upside down. So they ensure that you can only sit 1 person for every 3 chairs. But when I went in, there wasn't a single person in the waiting room. So it was a moot point. It wasn't necessary. However, if the pandemic does increase to the level that government is projecting, we are going to find doctors' rooms and hospitals and clinics become overcrowded. And that's the point at which doctors, especially, are going to have to embrace what they call telemedicine, remote consulting. So we saw at the beginning of the lockdown period that Vodacom partnered with Discovery Health to fund 10,000 remote doctors' consultations. So people on video conference speaking to their doctor and having the cost of that covered by Vodacom. So we'll probably see a lot more initiatives like that. But I was chatting with my doctor about that exact topic. I said, so have you done any remote consulting? He says, no, I find a telephone consultation is more effective. It's what I've been doing, and it's what I'll keep doing. So for many traditional doctors, they're still going to rely on the good old telephone, and more of our consultations are going to be telephonic. So for older people in particular, who don't have the tools and are not used to using tools like Zoom for business, for example, they are also probably going to be using the telephone. But telephone consulting is going to be probably redefined as telehealth, because in a way that's exactly what it is. The only difference is you're not doing it via a video screen or a video, but it's still distance consulting. However, along with that, you're going to find that every doctor is probably going to have some kind of Zoom facility or Teams or whatever tool they want to use. Most typically and most likely it'll be Zoom, because it's free for up to 40 minutes and it's easy to download. So doctors' consultations we'll see increasingly happen via Zoom, but also you're spending a lot more time on the phone. So don't expect to get through to your doctor as easily in the future. And then hospitals, we've seen quite a fantastic evolution in some hospitals in the Western Cape, for example, where they have this robot diagnostician, you might call it. It's really a TV screen on wheels. It's like a little base with a long neck and then a TV screen at the top, and it can move autonomously. So a doctor or an administrator sitting in an office can actually guide this little robot on its rounds of wards. And if, for example, you have a ward full of highly infectious patients, this moving TV screen that looks like it's a robot, but it's not really, it's just a moving TV screen, is going to stop at each bed and examine the patient at a distance. And the doctor will be able to get vital signs through the wires that are, or the plugs that are wired to the patient. So you'll be able to get, for example, blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate via the tools in ICU already. But the difference is that the doctor doesn't have to go to the patient to look at them or talk to them. They'll talk to them through these screens. Now, this won't be a common practice. These devices are very expensive, but we will see them used more and more. So if you do find yourself having to go to hospital or visiting someone in hospital, which I know is very rare these days, don't be shocked if you see a robot walking around talking to patients. That is one of the sort of more science fictional futures that are becoming a reality, not just in South Africa, but around the world. And between those two extremes, a doctor doing telephonic or video consultation and a robot doing ward rounds in a hospital, we'll also see the world of health evolve quite dramatically in the coming years. The world has changed. The entire world is having to adapt to a new way of working, of moving, of entertaining. And we all have to necessarily embrace that world, but acknowledge that world and find our best way through that world. So that means we have to become used to the technology that allows us to navigate that world. We don't have to be comfortable with the technology. You don't have to feel that this is a better way, as some might argue. But you do have to understand the role of the technology and the role that you play in that technology. I've not seen any questions come through, but do you have any questions now about how you want me to look at specific issues in terms of the future, the trends that will shape the future? I'll try to give my perspective based on the knowledge that we have and also the research that we've conducted into this area. And I'm going to ask Brian to field the questions. I see there's already a range of questions. So Charles Irons asked, how will COVID-19 change 4IR? For those who don't know, 4IR is the fourth industrial revolution. And that encompasses all the emerging technologies that are changing the way we work, play, educate, experience health, and the like. Well, COVID-19 has already accelerated 4IR dramatically. What you are experiencing now, this video streamed presentation, is an example of 4IR in practice. And the evolution of online education, in particular, is a classic example of 4IR in practice. 4IR talks about the need for distance education, online education, and the like. And our research has also shown that companies are far more likely to allow remote working, which is also an element of 4IR once the pandemic is over. So we found that 39% of South African enterprises who have allowed their staff to work from home will allow continued remote working once lockdown and social distancing is over. So that's an exact percentage on how COVID-19 is changing 4IR. Judith Shopley asked if there are issues of radiation or health-related concerns related to 5G. Now, that's a massively debated issue. There's quite a few sides to the argument. The one is that on the health impact of 5G. The other side is that the horror stories you hear are mostly myths or conspiracy theories, and the role of 5G in the spread of coronavirus is utterly false. All you have to do is look at a map of where 5G is rolled out and where the coronavirus is broken out. And you'll find that while there might be some correlation in some countries, generally speaking, there isn't a correlation. So the first country that had one of the first countries that had a massive outbreak after China was Iran. And Iran still hasn't even licensed 5G, let alone roll it out as 5G causing disease are just that. They are myths. Jim Powell asked, what is the danger of our political system moving to authoritarian or even effective dictatorship, simply carrying on the lockdown? Well, everyone has that fear, and there are signs of authoritarian thinking, but at the same time, we can see that we are moving through the phases of lockdown, and we can see that the government is trying to relax different areas of lockdown. So a lot of people instantly grabbed onto the conspiracy theory that lockdown was a new way of controlling the public. Well, the public doesn't like being controlled for too long. So we saw massive national solidarity when lockdown was first announced, because we're all in this together. But subsequent to that, we've started seeing the protests and the objections and the court cases. And government is cognizant of that. I don't think anyone wants lockdown to continue longer than it has to. So that is an unlikely fear in this country, but there are countries where you have authoritarian governments that will take advantage to clamp down further. So certainly not a yes or no answer to that one. Graham Leslie asks, a significant problem with online connectivity is the risk from viruses, hacking. Will these remain issues in the future, and will they continue to limit connectivity? They won't limit connectivity as such, but they are a massive issue. One of the biggest dangers at the moment is that people working from home don't have the protection that they would have in their workplace. So we are expecting to see a massive increase in hacking. The antivirus companies like Kaspersky, for example, has already shared with us a massive, their data on a massive increase in attempts to attack individuals by getting them to click on links because they're working from home, because they're not protected by the company's systems. They are sitting targets for these hackers. So yes, what that requires from anyone using, be very aware of any link you click on. Someone sends you a link, be sure you know what's behind that link. Don't just click blindly on that link. Wanda Ruiz says, given our huge and increasing dependence on data now, likely to see more cost reductions in this area from the network providers. I don't believe we'll see any reductions in costs unless they're forced on the network providers. It's an argument that we've had for many years, that only action by the regulators will actually bring down data costs. And that's exactly what happened now. The Competition Commission declared in December that the operators had to bring down the cost of data for people who couldn't afford big bundles. If you can afford a big bundle, then data is very cheap. MTN has an offering now which makes data almost a fraction of a cent. You can get something like 1 gig every day for the month for something like 21 Rand a gig, which is an incredibly low level. That's what some people pay for just 10 megs, for example. So for the wealthy, data has come down dramatically. For the poor, data only comes down when it is forced down by regulatory pressure. So thanks to the Competition Commission's requirement, for example, Vodacom and MTN agreed to bring down the cost of 1 gig bundle from 149 Rand to 99 Rand. Bear in mind, that's the same 1 gig bundle that if you can afford to buy a bundle, it will only cost you 21 Rand. But for the poor, it's 99 Rand. And that's the shape of the digital divide in this country. So we can't expect favors from the operators, but we can expect to see ongoing pressure from government to bring down those costs. Then Penny Abbott asked, is the government in a position to require the mobile networks to improve service in the underserviced areas as a condition of their license renewal? Well, yes, that is in fact what government requires from the operators as one of the conditions. And also in terms of issuing new spectrum, and this is one of the big debates of the last few years, is government delaying the issue of new spectrum. That issuing of new spectrum can and probably will go hand in hand with government insisting and demanding that to get that spectrum, they have to roll out their services more aggressively into underserviced areas. So we can expect that to happen, in fact, because it is one of the answers also to 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, benefiting all, and for online education becoming more widely available. Les Bowring asks, how can we listen to other of your webinars? Well, thanks for that implied compliment. I appreciate it. A lot of my webinars are hosted by companies that send out to their clients. So it's hard to tell when and where, but you'll be to follow me on Twitter. If you are on Twitter, my Twitter handle is art, A-R-T, and then the number 2, and then G-E-E, or on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is actually where I tend to share most of my presentation information. So LinkedIn is free to join, and you can just look for my name on LinkedIn and ask for me to connect to you on LinkedIn. I tend to accept most connections if you don't look like a dodgy person on LinkedIn. And then I have a group on LinkedIn called Facing the Webcam, which trains people in how to use webinars or how to participate in webinars or teleconferences. And you're welcome to request to join that group as well if you want to participate in webinars in the future. Wanda Ruiz again, how would you recommend that people who are not tech savvy and afraid to engage in potentially threatening online transactions can start upskilling yourselves in a focused and systematic way? The best way is actually to have someone hold your hand through it. And not everyone has family and friends who are available for that purpose. But if you do, that's actually the way. find someone who is doing it regularly and let them guide you through it. You actually very often need someone to sit down with you. And I've had that experience with a staff who wanted to do online banking for the first time. And it was very scary for that person, very threatening as well. And I had to literally hold her hand through it and show her how it works. And even if you've done that once, the next time you have to be reminded, you have to get used to it. So find someone who can hold your hand through the process. That I know it's a glib and easy answer, but that is the best way to do it. Marion Jill Bregman asked, how will gyms and spas change for lockdowns? Are they all online? I actually wrote an article on this. So one of the other ways to keep up with my thinking and what I talk about and research is to visit Gadget magazine. That's gadget.co.za. And I do a weekly column in Gadget, which at the moment has been focused on how COVID-19 has changed the world. And last week, it was actually about gyms and spas and how they have changed. And what most of them have done is introduced online classes and online advice. And some of these classes have been spectacularly successful. So internationally, there are gyms that find themselves with thousands of people attending a gym class. South Africa, we've seen events with hundreds, and one I think as big as 500 people attending one gym class. Yoga teachers were among the first to embrace this platform when lockdown began. Some were already teaching online. Others have learned how to present online. So what they are doing is looking at what their peers are doing. So yoga teachers, fitness instructors, and the like are all looking at best practice. They're exploring, they're searching via Google to see who is doing what, and they're trying to either replicate or improve on those models. It doesn't make up for gyms not having people coming in and not paying membership fees, but it is one way for them to continue to generate revenue, or at least to remain top of mind in the public eye. Chris Palk asked, is TeamViewer going to be the best and most common form of remote IT assistance? Are there alternatives? And Brian answered that question already. What I can say is I actually watched TeamViewer in action yesterday, and it was quite incredible to watch someone taking over a computer remotely and going through certain processes on that computer. But there are numerous tools like that. Citrix, for example, is one of the best known companies in the world for remote control, but Microsoft itself has tools for that kind of purpose. So there are numerous tools, and it's hard to say which one will be the dominant one in the future. Clive Milner asked to clarify fake news. WhatsApp wants to charge R3 per day. That's expensive for pensioners. No, that's fake news. WhatsApp is not going to charge for use. The moment they charge for use, people will, will skip to another platform. So don't worry about those kind of WhatsApp warnings that WhatsApp is about to do this or WhatsApp do that. If it were true, it would actually be reported in the media, and there would be a big fuss in the media. If you are seeing it for the first time via a friend who has shared something with you on WhatsApp, you can almost be certain that it's a hoax or it's fakes. If WhatsApp is going to change the terms of service, you'll also get an announcement in WhatsApp itself, not from a friend, not from a forwarded message, but in WhatsApp itself, you'll get some kind of announcement of a change in the terms or options. Ignore any message that says WhatsApp is about to change things that you have to pay and the like. Bridget Pohl asked, do you see an opportunity for an NGO, that's a non-governmental organization, to set up educational hubs staffed by younger people in under-resourced areas? I think that's a fantastic idea. It's definitely a great opportunity, but they would need funding for that. I can't imagine that there isn't funding for those kind of initiatives. And I think it's a great idea, Bridget, and I think it's also a great opportunity. Nokulunga Tobajani asked, what about travel and tourism? Those are among the sectors that are the worst hit, and they'll continue to be badly hit by this crisis. So one of these stories I mentioned that I'm writing in Gadget about how the pandemic is affecting different sectors, I'm busy working on one on how the travel and tourism sector will be affected. So that is a topic I'll address in greater depth. But what I can say is airlines are already in deep trouble. Many won't survive. Those that do survive are going to have to practice social distancing on their aircraft, which means smaller passenger loads, which means higher ticket prices, which means fewer people will be able to afford travel. So air travel is going to become a luxury. It used to be a luxury and then it became a commonplace. Now it will be a luxury again, sadly. Business travel will probably save some of the airlines, but even business travel will be cut down dramatically because businesses have realized that many of the meetings for which people travel can be conducted effectively via tools like this, via video conferencing. The travel industry as such is facing a few years of tremendous hardship. Tourism will plummet, but once the pandemic is over, you're going to see a massive increase in tourism. People are desperate for those physical experiences, desperate for seeing other places. But the emphasis is most likely going to be on local tourism. So, for example, people in South Africa exploring their own country to an extent that they never have before. So that's one long-term benefit of this catastrophe for the travel and tourism industry. Mick or Mike Brickhill says, how will this era impact children going forward? Will standards be maintained or forced to drop by lack of resources based on affordability? That is an important question. And unfortunately, the answer is not a very positive one. In the short term, this is something that actually struck me already, seeing the limited class time that our own kids are going to be having at a private school and understanding the extent to which this will be exacerbated in other schools that don't have these tools. In the short term, government is going to have to lower standards in terms of how kids get tested, the extent to which they get tested, and the marks that are required to pass. So 2020 for many is going to be almost a lost year from an educational point of view, and not necessarily a lost year in terms of not going to school at all, but a lost year in terms of the level of education that is provided to our children, whether at a private school, a government school, or an underprivileged school. I won't say everyone will suffer the same damage, but everyone will suffer damage, regrettably. We have to be aware of that. We have to acknowledge it in order to address it. If we try to close our eyes to that reality, we won't be able to address it effectively. So if you hear the Department of Education saying that they'll provide the exact same quality course or curriculum or testing this year as in the past, then they're really trying to hide the reality. They're trying to paper over the crack that has broken education in 2020. If we acknowledge that and we see this as a kind of half year almost, then that can be addressed in subsequent years. The people who will suffer the most this year are the matrics because of the limited teaching that they're receiving and also the uncertainty surrounding matriculation this year. That's taking a massive psychological toll on children. And I think that's as severe as the damage to their education this year. And then finally, a question from Marion Jill Bergman again. How safe are services like PayFast, WalletDoc, and SnapScan? They're as safe as, they're probably safer than carrying physical money these days. Firstly, you're protected from infection when you're using those tools. But PayFast is highly reputable, highly respectable, and they've also gone to great pains to ensure that their systems are safe and secure. SnapScan and Zapper, which is a similar tool to SnapScan, also very secure. I'm not aware of breaches and of fraud or any other damage created by these kind of tools. I don't know WalletDoc, I'll be quite honest. Maybe Brian can make a comment on WalletDoc if he knows it. But the mainstream payment tools that are being used at the moment, like PayFast, SnapScan, and Zapper, are safer than using cash right now. So with that, I think we were able to cover a lot more ground than I imagined. I thank all of those who joined us. If you really enjoyed this, you can give us a thumbs up. We always appreciate that kind of response. Incidentally, that's one of the ways that a webinar where you can't see your audience can become interactive through the kind of questions that you've been posing in the chat room and through giving thumbs up or other forms of reaction. Thanks. I see the thumbs ups flowing through. I appreciate that. I enjoyed talking to you. I know I couldn't see you. I know I couldn't interact with you, but I felt you out there. Seeing the names of the people putting the questions was great. Seeing you all respond as well when I asked you to give the numbers or respond whether you were using certain services and tools also gave me a sense of an audience out there. So I feel that I'm engaging with you, and I hope you've enjoyed engaging with me as well. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. It's sobering. It's scary as well, but I hope it's also been informative and enlightening as well. Thank you for your time, and thank you all for joining us this morning.